After the Battle of Marcianople, the situation changed dramatically. The Goths quickly became the rulers of Thrace without encountering any opposition. The remaining Roman detachments of the Thracian field army were confined to the key cities, none of which had the strength to confront the Goths individually. Valens, with the eastern presental army, was still in the east dealing with the Persians. While Gratian, leading the main western army, was occupied with the Alemanni along the Rhine. The situation deteriorated significantly when Roman troops of Gothic origin, stationed in winter quarters at Adrianople, joined the rebellion. These troops, commanded by Surdias and Collias, initially remained loyal to Rome. However, concerns arose when orders were given for their relocation eastward, driven by fears that they might align with Fritigern, who was advancing towards Adrianople. The soldiers requested a 2-day respite to make preparations and asked for provisions and funds for their journey. The chief magistrate of Adrianople, however, refused their request. Motivated partly by a desire for revenge, since Gothic forces had previously plundered his suburban villa, he incited the lower classes and the armaments factory workers in the city to forcefully expel the Goths. According to the historian Ammianus, the Goths initially remained steadfast, enduring verbal abuse and a few projectiles thrown at them. However, when the harassment escalated, the Goths, initially hesitant, eventually lost patience. They drew their swords and charged at the crowd, inciting widespread panic. The confrontation resulted in numerous casualties, predominantly civilians. Realizing that their position was now untenable, the Goths departed Adrianople and joined Fritigern's forces, who had already begun their southward advance after a successful engagement with Lupicinus. Upon reaching Adrianople, Fritigern initiated a siege of the city, but his attempts to storm the walls were unsuccessful. The city's small garrison, though comprising few trained soldiers, managed to repel the disorderly and unconcentrated attacks of the Goths. Fritigern eventually abandoned the siege and dispersed his forces into smaller bands to forage and feed themselves in anticipation of winter. Meanwhile, Fritigern's numbers continued to grow as freed Gothic slaves and some Roman prisoners joined his ranks, providing valuable local intelligence. The situation had become critical for both the Romans and the Goths. The Romans recognized the need for a significant effort to overcome the Goths, but they lacked immediate access to high-quality troops. Along the frontiers, intense pressure persisted. The Huns and Alans, catalysts of these events, remained a threat, with some of their groups advancing toward the Danube. Additionally, various other Germanic groups could potentially be lured into Roman territory, either to flee the Huns or to capitalize on weakened Roman defenses. In the midst of a challenging Roman situation, the Goths found themselves in a desperate position. Though they had initially defeated local forces and compelled the Romans to confine themselves within fortified cities, the Goths had no refuge and lacked a reliable source of food and supplies. For their long-term survival, they sought to negotiate a peace with the Romans and secure land for settlement and farming, essentially seeking to reinstate the terms of their original agreement with Valens upon crossing the Danube. Time was not on their side, as a delay in reaching favorable terms with the Romans increased the risk of succumbing to starvation. Without a stable supply source, the Goths were forced to forage in small groups across a wide area, rendering them vulnerable to larger, better-equipped Roman forces. This situation also heightened the likelihood of individual chieftains rejecting Fritigern's leadership and striking out on their own. Fritigern faced the dilemma of needing a sufficiently large force to defeat a Roman army and negotiate a favorable peace, while simultaneously recognizing that a larger force increased the risk of succumbing to hunger. Additionally, the Goths' lack of a homeland meant that they were accompanied by a significant number of non-combatants who required protection and sustenance. Valens was aware of the situation, but he couldn't afford to stand idly by and allow the Goths to freely operate in Thrace without risking loss of both political and domestic support. To address this, he dispatched his Magister Equitam, Victor, to negotiate an agreement in the east with Persia, while also reallocating some troops from Armenia to be led by Profuturus and Trajan in a guerrilla campaign against the Goths. Additionally, Valens sought additional troops from Gratian in the west. Although the specific composition of Profuturus and Trajan's force is unclear, it appears to have been predominantly infantry, as Ammianus mentions that they commanded the legions brought from Armenia. Despite these legions' previous commendable performance, they were inexperienced in this type of warfare and faced numerical inferiority. Nevertheless, they succeeded in driving some of the Goths out of the lowlands, forcing them to seek shelter in the rugged Balkan mountains where it was hoped they would ultimately perish from hunger. Gratian responded to his uncle's request for aid by dispatching the aging General Fritigern along with reinforcements characterized by Ammianus as Pannonian and Transalpine auxiliaries. It is challenging to definitively ascertain the nature of these troops, but it is possible that they were Limitanae recruited from those specific regions. While Ammianus refers to them as auxiliaries, it is improbable that they were elite auxilia palatina, as he generally identifies such units by their specific names. The description suggests that these troops were likely ordinary second-rate forces. Gratian also dispatched Richemers, his commander of Commos Domesticorum, along with a contingent of soldiers from the Gallic Field Army. However, when these units were tasked to move east, there were significant desertions, a phenomenon not uncommon during long-distance deployments. So, the troops under Richemer's command were severely depleted, likely operating at less than half of their nominal strength. The activities of the Goths during the eastern march of the western reinforcements remain unclear. While some were hindered in the Balkan mountain passes, others were situated in the low-lying region of Scythia near the mouth of the Danube. It is feasible that these individuals were recent arrivals, potentially Gruthungi, who had migrated across the river. Alternatively, they could have been a group that had eluded the efforts of Profuturus and Trajan to force them into the Balkan mountains. Fritigern and Richomers joined forces with Profuturus and Trajan near the town of Ad Salices in the Dobrogei region of southeastern Romania. Not far from there, a large group of barbarians had positioned their wagons in a protective circle, where they were leisurely enjoying their plunder as if they were within fortified city walls. Richomers assumed command of the combined Roman forces and sought an opportunity to launch an attack. Recognizing that they were not sufficiently equipped to assault the Gothic wagon laager, Romans chose to bide their time, anticipating that the Goths would eventually have to move in search of food or to avoid disease from a contaminated camp. Once the Goths made their move, the Romans could capitalize on the vulnerable column and gradually weaken it through a series of guerrilla-style attacks. The Goths, being aware of the Roman intentions through deserters, chose to remain in their position for as long as possible, while calling upon other scattered parties to reinforce them. Their call for reinforcement was answered, and it wasn't long before the Goths felt confident enough to attempt an attack on the nearby Romans. The following morning, both the Roman and Gothic forces prepared for battle. Trumpets sounded in the Roman camp, summoning each soldier to join their unit and assume their designated positions. Similarly, the barbarians used trumpets to assemble their warriors, who formed ranks as if they had undergone formal training. In accordance with their tradition, the Gothic warriors renewed their oaths to their commanders, vowing to die rather than desert them in times of peril. They also pledged mutual support to their comrades. The Gothic warriors, in a disciplined manner, emerged from their defensive wagon circle, spreading across the plain in a steadily growing mass. Meanwhile, the Romans were organizing themselves a few hundred yards away. As the last Roman soldiers hurried to their positions, their commanders observed the advancing enemy, indicating the imminent clash. As the morning sun stretched its long shadows over the plain, the Roman and Gothic armies stood facing each other, each side consisting of several thousand men. The majority were infantry, wearing Roman helmets and coats of mail that the Goths had acquired over time, evening the odds in terms of equipment. As the armies assembled, cavalry units circled restlessly around the infantry formations. These mounted warriors were prepared to chase down and cut down any soldiers who tried to flee. But the dense spear formations of the infantry made it difficult for them to play a decisive role in the coming battle. Meanwhile, archers and slingers stayed at the rear, their eyes scanning for any opening to exploit, ready to rain arrows and stones upon any enemy who dared to expose themselves. Both armies began to move closer, each intent on demonstrating their fearlessness and readiness for combat. However, advancing and engaging in actual combat were two distinct actions. Contrary to cinematic portrayals of two massive forces clad in iron armor charging at each other, the reality was different. The two armies approached each other tentatively, frequently halting, with neither side immediately committing to the first strike. Ancient warfare involved numerous rituals. To bolster their own courage and demoralize their opponents, the Romans would collectively shout their war cry, known as the Battle. This term, originally referring to the trumpeting of an elephant, described a cry that was more animalistic than human, a deep mooing sound that began low and gradually rose to a deafening howl. Notably, the Roman soldiers, including many immigrants from foreign lands, had adopted this battle cry from the Germanic tribes. The Goths followed their ancestral customs to challenge their enemies. They advanced into no man's land, praised their forefathers, and vowed not to dishonor them. 200 years later, the last Gothic king in Italy, Totila, performed similar rituals before the Battle of Tagnay, showing off his horsemanship and lance skills as if his ancestors were watching. Both sides tried to boost their courage by insulting each other. Soldiers close enough began throwing javelins, and archers hidden behind the lines shot arrows. These missiles didn't cause much damage, but could make the enemy nervous and weaken their shields by sticking into them, making them heavy and eventually unusable. Gradually, the battle began. Some groups, too impatient to wait, moved forward and challenged the enemy. Amidst the shouting in different languages, skirmishes broke out, as described by Ammianus. How long the two armies remained positioned just a javelin's throw apart, their warriors restlessly swaying forward and backward, exchanging raucous threats and boasts before the impending clash, is not precisely documented. Eventually, as the tension reached its peak, their inhibitions evaporated, and without a formal command, the two walls of shields advanced and met in a thunderous collision. As the front lines collided, it was not the grand, sweeping motion often depicted in movies, but a brutal, grinding press of bodies and shields. Each soldier, driven by a mix of adrenaline, fear, and determination, sought not just to protect himself, but to gain an advantage. The infantry on both sides pushed against each other, their formations becoming an indistinguishable mass of humanity. The pressure was immense, and the noise was deafening, with the clash of metal, the grunts of exertion, and the screams of the wounded creating a nightmarish symphony. The Gothic and Roman soldiers were locked in a desperate struggle, each trying to find a way to stab their adversary from below or knock them down to be trampled underfoot. There was no room for individual heroics. Survival depended on maintaining formation and pushing forward as one unit. Shields were held tightly, not just for personal protection, but to form a barrier that could resist the enemy's advance. The soldiers sought shelter behind their own shields and those of their comrades, a reflex described by ancient authors as typical of all combatants in such chaotic melees. For those at the front, it was a brutal contest of strength and endurance. The dense press of bodies meant that movement was limited, and the risk of being pushed to the ground was ever present. Any soldier who lost his composure, dropped his weapons, and attempted to flee was immediately vulnerable. The cavalry, watching for just such moments, would surge forward to cut down the deserters with ruthless efficiency. Amid the dust and chaos, the archers and slingers occasionally found their moments, releasing volleys that arced over the heads of their own troops to land among the enemy. The battle became a test of wills, each side pushing relentlessly, ignoring the mounting casualties. The soldiers were driven by a primal urge to survive, their minds focused solely on the immediate struggle. The dust filled the air, coating armor and skin, while the screams of the wounded and dying added to the horror of the scene. Those who fell were trampled without mercy, becoming part of the blood-soaked ground over which their comrades fought. Hours passed in this gruesome stalemate, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The sheer exhaustion began to take its toll, and the initial frenzy of combat gave way to a grim determination. Soldiers continued to push, stab, and shield themselves, their movements becoming slower but no less deadly. As the battle progressed, it appeared that the Roman left wing began to yield ground, allowing the barbarian shield wall to advance in that area of the battlefield. However, the Roman commanders had anticipated this turn of events. In ancient warfare, the left wing traditionally remained the defensive stronghold, as infantry soldiers carried their shields on their left arms. Consequently, as they advanced, they instinctively sought cover behind the shields of their comrades, causing the formation to shift towards the right. Recognizing this pattern, Ricimer, as the highest-ranking officer leading that day, had carefully positioned reserve troops on the left flank, effectively thwarting the barbarian advance. As night descended, the battle persisted, although by then few had the strength to continue fighting. Ancient battles were grueling, with soldiers engaged from the outset and unable to endure for more than a few hours, regardless of their training. Gradually, some units began to lose contact. Those forced to retreat halted and did not return to the attack. Eventually, the two armies found themselves separated once again. Slowly, the Goths withdrew to the safety of their wagon circle, while the Romans retreated to their camp. Following their custom, the Romans attempted to retrieve the bodies of their fallen officers for proper burial rites. However, the bodies of ordinary soldiers were left behind, to be consumed by carrion birds. Years later, as noted by the historian Ammianus, travelers passing by the battlefield could still see it strewn with bones, bleached white by the sun. The exact number of casualties from that day cannot be determined, but it is certain that both sides suffered heavy, if not enormous losses. In ancient battles, the true massacre typically began when one army fled, allowing the pursuers to kill the fugitives without facing much risk. However, when a battle ended without a decisive victor, as was the case at Ad Salices, casualties were likely more limited. Despite this, the combined toll of the dead, wounded, injured, and those in shock would have significantly reduced the combat effectiveness of both armies. The Roman columns retreated for several days, covering more than 60 miles before halting at Marcianople. Meanwhile, the Goths, having suffered significant casualties, remained within their wagon circle for a week, during which they buried their dead and performed funeral rites for their fallen comrades. For a period, the Goths sustained themselves by exploiting the resources of the plains along the Danube delta. They robbed peasants, seized supplies from farms, and slaughtered livestock. Eventually, they realized that it was becoming increasingly difficult to find sufficient food in this underdeveloped region. Observing that the Romans had not dared to attack them again after the battle and had, in fact, withdrawn, the Gothic leaders decided not to resume their northward march across the Danube back to their homeland. Instead, they chose to head south into the agriculturally rich Thracian hinterland, seeking new provinces to plunder. Both sides met again at the Battle of Adrianople on the 9th of August, 378 AD.